A belligerent drunk interrupted Johnny Cash's concert, yelling insults and demanding he prove he's a real man. Instead of having security remove him, Cash did something that left the entire prison speechless. It was January 13th, 1968, at Folsom State Prison, and Johnny Cash was in the middle of one of his most legendary performances. The crowd of 2,000 inmates was eating up every second of his set, and Cash was feeding off their energy like electricity. He'd just finished an explosive version of Folsom Prison Blues and was transitioning into cocaine blues when something happened that nobody in that prison would ever forget. From somewhere in the back section, a loud, slurred voice cut through the music and the crowd noise like a knife through silk. "Cash, you ain't nothing but a fake." The voice belonged to Frank "Red" Daniels, a 5-year-old former prison guard from Sacramento who'd been drinking heavily since noon. Red was what you'd call a professional troublemaker, the kind of guy who picked fights at sporting events and thought famous people needed to be taken down a peg. He'd gotten visitor access to Cash's show, not because he was a fan, but because he wanted to prove some twisted point about celebrities being soft and fake. In his alcohol-clouded mind, he'd convinced himself that Johnny Cash was nothing more than a pretty boy who'd never faced a real challenge. "You hear me, Cash? You're a phony!" Johnny stopped singing mid-verse. The Tennessee Three, confused, gradually stopped playing. 2,000 inmates turned to look at this drunk man standing in his seat, swaying slightly, pointing aggressively at the stage. Cash's first reaction was what you'd expect from any professional performer. He tried to handle it with humor and redirect the energy back to the show. "Well, hello there, friend," Cash said into his microphone, his voice carrying that familiar deep rumble. "Looks like we got ourselves a music critic in the house tonight." The inmates laughed, expecting this to diffuse the situation. Most hecklers, when acknowledged by the performer, either sit down embarrassed or get escorted out by security. But Big Mike wasn't most hecklers. "Don't you friend me, boy," Red shouted back, his voice carrying clearly through the prison. "I'm talking to you. You think you're so tough with your black clothes and your singing? Why don't you come down here and prove you're a real man?" The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. This wasn't just drunken nonsense anymore. This was a direct challenge, and everyone could feel the tension ratcheting up. Cash stood at the microphone for a moment, studying this drunk man, who was now causing other visitors to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Guards were starting to move toward Red's section, but Cash held up a hand to stop them. "Sir," Cash said, his voice still calm, but with a slight edge, "you came here tonight as a guest, just like everyone else. How about we all just enjoy the music?" "I don't want to enjoy your music," Red yelled back. "I want to see if you're anything more than a mama's boy who pretends to understand these men." That last comment hit Cash in a way that was visible to everyone in the prison. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the famous Cash intensity became something darker. The crowd was getting restless. Some inmates were booing Red. Others were shouting for guards to remove him. The energy that had been joyful and celebratory was now tense and ugly. What happened next surprised everyone, including Cash's own band and the prison staff. Instead of signaling for security to remove the heckler, instead of trying to ignore him and continue with the show, Cash set down his microphone and started walking toward the edge of the stage. "You want to know if I'm a real man?" Cash said, his voice now carrying clearly through the prison. "You think I'm just some pretty boy who can't handle himself?" The prison went dead silent. 2,000 inmates held their breath, unsure of what they were about to witness. Cash looked directly at Red and said, "Well, friend, I tell you what, why don't you come up here and we'll settle this like gentlemen?" The audience erupted. Some inmates were cheering. Others were shouting, "Don't do it, Cash!" Guards were frantically trying to figure out what to do. Cash's producer, Bob Johnston, was reportedly panicking in the control room, but Cash wasn't done. "Come on up here," Cash repeated, gesturing toward the stage. "You want to prove something? Let's prove it. But I'll tell you what, we're not going to fight like animals. We're going to settle this the way real men settle things." Red, emboldened by the alcohol and the attention, started pushing his way toward the stage. "Damn right we are," he shouted. Guards tried to intercept him, but Cash waved them off. "Let him come," Cash said. "Let him come up here." When Red finally made it to the stage, stumbling slightly as he climbed up, the entire prison was in chaos. Inmates were on their feet, some screaming, some trying to get closer to see what was going to happen. Cash walked over to where Red was standing, and for a moment, the two men faced each other. Cash in his iconic black outfit, calm and controlled, and Red, sweaty and swaying, clearly intoxicated, but still aggressive. "All right, friend," Cash said, close enough now that his voice carried through the microphone. "You want to prove who's the real man here? I got a proposition for you." "Bring it on," Red slurred. "Here's what we're going to do," Cash said, his voice suddenly taking on that smooth, confident tone that had charmed millions. "We're going to have ourselves a singing contest. You and me. Right here. Right now. Winner takes all." The suggestion was so unexpected, so completely different from what anyone thought was going to happen, that it took a moment for the crowd to process it. A singing contest. This drunk Heckler versus Johnny Cash in a singing contest. Then someone in the audience started laughing. Then someone else. Within seconds, the entire prison was filled with laughter and applause. The tension that had been building toward violence suddenly transformed into anticipation for something completely different. Red, however, was not amused. "I don't want to sing with you. I want to fight you." "Well, that's too bad," Cash said, grinning now. "Because this is my stage. These are my people, and we do things my way here. You want to prove you're tougher than me? Then prove you can do what I do. Sing." Cash gestured to Luther Perkins, his longtime guitarist, who was watching this entire scene with his mouth hanging open. "Luther, give the man a guitar pick," Cash said. "And boys," he called to his band, "let's give our new friend here a chance to show us what he's got." The Tennessee Three, still in shock but following Cash's lead, prepared to play. Red handed a microphone, and suddenly the center of attention, in a way he hadn't expected, looked around the prison with a mixture of confusion and panic. "What? What do you want me to sing?" he asked, his aggressive tone now replaced with uncertainty. "Whatever you want, friend," Cash said magnanimously. "This is your moment. 2,000 men are waiting to hear what you've got to say." What followed was both hilarious and oddly touching. Red, clearly out of his element but trapped by his own bravado, attempted to sing "I Walk the Line," apparently the only Cash song he could think of in his alcohol-fogged brain. His performance was predictably terrible. He was off-key, forgot half the words, and swayed so much that Marshal Grant had to steady him to keep him from falling over. But here's the remarkable part. Instead of the audience booing or laughing at him, something else happened. As Red struggled through the song, clearly embarrassed and vulnerable, the inmates began to cheer him on. "You got this! Keep going! Sing it, Red!" Cash, standing beside him, began clapping along and encouraging him. When Red forgot the words, Cash would whisper them to him. When he started to give up, Cash put his arm around his shoulders and kept him going. By the time Red finished his stumbling version of "I Walk the Line," something had changed in the room. This angry, belligerent drunk, who had come to cause trouble, had become, for a few minutes, just another person trying his best at something difficult. The inmates gave him a standing ovation, not because he sang well, but because he tried, and because Cash had created a space where even a hostile heckler could be transformed into someone worth cheering for. "That was beautiful, Red," Cash said, genuinely seeming to mean it. "That took real courage." Red, now clearly emotional and no longer aggressive, looked around the prison in wonder. "I can't believe they're clapping for me." "Of course they are," Cash said. "You just did something brave. You got up here and tried something new in front of 2,000 people. That's more than most folks ever do." "Now," Cash said, grinning at the crowd, "I suppose it's my turn." But instead of showing off with one of his big hits, instead of demonstrating the vast difference in talent between himself and the heckler, Cash did something that showed his true character. He sang "Peace in the Valley," a simple gospel song that invited audience participation. And he made sure that Red sang along with him, giving him harmony parts and making him feel like a true part of the performance. The two men stood on stage together, the man in black and a drunk former prison guard from Sacramento, singing gospel music while 2,000 inmates joined in. When the song ended, Cash turned to Red with genuine warmth. "Red, I want to ask you something," Cash said. "What made you so angry tonight? What's really bothering you?" The question, asked with such sincere concern, seemed to break something open in Red. In front of 2,000 people, this tough former guard started to cry. I lost my job last month," Red said into the microphone, his voice shaking. "My wife left me. I wanted someone to pay attention to me. I wanted to matter." The prison went completely silent. Cash put his arm around Red's shoulders. "Brother, you matter. You matter to me, and you matter to every man in this room. We all have times when we feel lost and angry, but you don't have to tear other people down to build yourself up." What Cash did next became the stuff of music legend. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cash said to the audience, "I want to tell you about the real courage I've seen tonight. It wasn't Red coming up here to cause trouble. It was Red admitting when he was hurting and asking for help. That takes more guts than any fight ever could." Cash then announced that he was personally going to help Red find a job in Sacramento, and that if anyone knew of construction companies that needed a hard worker, they should reach out. "Because that's what we do for each other," Cash said. "We help. We don't tear down, we build up." Red stayed for the rest of the concert, sitting on the side of the stage, occasionally joining in on songs when Cash invited him. By the end of the night, he had gone from being the show's biggest disruption to being part of its most memorable moments. 3 construction company owners contacted Cash's management after the show with job offers for Red. He chose one, moved back to work in Sacramento, and worked there for the next 15 years until his retirement. But more importantly, the story of what happened that night spread throughout the music world and beyond. It became a legendary example of how to handle conflict with grace, wisdom, and compassion. Other performers began talking about Cash's handling of the Heckler situation. Instead of using security or legal measures to deal with disruptive audience members, some started trying to find creative ways to turn negative energy into positive experiences. Cash showed us that every heckler is just a human being having a bad day, said comedian Bill Cosby, who was performing regularly in the late 1960 seconds. He turned an enemy into a friend in front of 2,000 inmates. That's not just good showmanship, that's good humanity. For Cash, the incident was meaningful because it reinforced his belief that his role as a performer was about more than just entertainment. "I realized that night that I have a responsibility," Cash told Marshall Grant afterward. "When someone comes to my show, whether they're a fan or a heckler, I have an opportunity to make their life a little better. That's not something I take lightly." Cash began incorporating more direct audience interaction into his shows, always looking for opportunities to connect with people who seemed to be struggling or upset. The entire incident was captured on the recordings that eventually became the legendary At Folsom Prison album sessions, though this particular exchange was edited out of the final release. But bootleg recordings have become some of the most treasured Cash audio documents among collectors. It's not just the music that people value, it's Cash's handling of the confrontation, his wisdom, and his compassion. "You can hear Cash thinking in real time," said Cash historian Michael Streiskuth. "You can hear him deciding to choose love over conflict, understanding over judgment. It's a masterclass in human decency." The story of Cash and Red Daniels became a parable about how to handle conflict in any situation. Instead of meeting aggression with aggression, Cash chose to meet it with curiosity, compassion, and creativity. He turned a potential fight into a teaching moment, a hostile confrontation into a healing experience, and an enemy into a friend. Cash proved that night that you don't defeat your enemies by fighting them, said civil rights leader John Lewis, who later cited the incident in speeches about nonviolent conflict resolution. You defeat them by loving them until they become your friends. Today, the story of Cash and the Heckler is taught in conflict resolution courses and cited by therapists as an example of how to de-escalate tense situations through empathy and understanding. Red Daniels, before his death in 2003, gave several interviews about that night. In each one, he credited Cash with saving his life by showing him that there were better ways to deal with pain than lashing out at others. Cash could have humiliated me in front of all those people, Red said in his final interview. Instead, he helped me find my dignity. He turned the worst night of my life into the beginning of a better life. The confrontation between Johnny Cash and Red Daniels reminds us that behind every act of aggression is usually a person in pain. And it shows us that the strongest response to hostility isn't more hostility, it's understanding, compassion, and the willingness to see the humanity in everyone. Cash could have had Red thrown out, could have made jokes at his expense, could have used his power and position to humiliate him. Instead, he chose to help him, to heal him, and to show 2,000 inmates what real strength looks like. That's why nearly 50 years later, people still talk about the night Johnny Cash turned a heckler into a friend. It wasn't just great entertainment. It was great humanity. And in a world that often seems divided by anger and misunderstanding, maybe that's exactly the kind of story we need to hear. If this incredible story of turning conflict into compassion moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of choosing understanding over anger. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone's kindness changed your perspective completely? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the moments that reveal the best of human nature.